So you're telling me you're going for the R rating, and you're not even going to bother taking the loincloth off Jesus?
So, does that mean that if you did take the loincloth off, that would be the only undamaged part of his entire body?
Welcome to Faith on Film, where we raid the church library in search of the good stuff. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Stephanie. And today we're looking at The Passion of the Christ.
It's the highest grossing non-English and religious movie in the U.S., and still the top R-rated movie in the U.S. Sorry, Deadpool, you came close.
It also sparked a wave of independently made religious films that we're still enjoying nearly 10 years later. It's also one of the most controversial films ever made. It's violent. It's depressing.
It's often called racist.
But, is it any good? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Now, since we are going to be doing a lot of these, let's start off with our Jesus movie checklist.
Now, first up is Exposition. The movie's fighting an uphill battle here because it's focusing in on the last 12 hours of Jesus' life. And as such, you never really get to know the world Jesus came into or why he's even being arrested.
The other problem with starting Jesus' story right here is we, the audience, aren't even really sure who's playing who yet. I mean, we know which one's Jesus because we've seen enough movies and paintings to know that he's the one with the long brown hair and the beard. And he's also, yes, he is also on the poster. But which one of the disciples is Peter? Which one's John? Which one's James? Or, the Pharisees? Which one's Nicodemus? Which one's Joseph of Arimathea?
Well, anyone not familiar with the story is only going to see two random chief priests objecting and then getting kicked out. And then their Christian friend has to explain John 3 to them.
Or take Pilate's wife. If you already know that Pilate's wife approaches him and tells him about a dream that she had, telling him not to have anything to do with this, then him observing her tossing and turning in her sleep makes perfect sense. But, seeing as this movie doesn't actually have her go up to her husband and tell him about a dream she had and warning him not to get involved in any of this, once again, you need your Christian friend to explain what's going on. But on the upside, this Claudia gets more to do than Angela Lansbury did.
And then there's also the Holy of Holies. If you don't know what that is or what its significance is, then the earthquake in the temple isn't going to mean very much to you. It doesn't help that it's filmed from so far away you can barely see the temple ripping. I mean, it's the hand of God at work after all. Now, could you effectively do the last 12 hours of Jesus' life alone? Sure, but you'd need more work to explain background and character and motivations.
Like, who are these people and what are they doing?
Exactly.
Fair enough. Well, it does look like next up is chief disciple, Peter.
Well, Peter's a pretty standard portrayal. He's good, but there's not really much to say about him. So, next.
Well, it looks like we're at Judas. Yeah, about this movie's Judas.
Okay, so first off, since Judas's motivation changes all the time, his motivation here appears to be pure greed because of the way he scoops up the money that the priest throws on the ground.
So is dropping that 30 pieces of silver was supposed to be?
And the main reason he's given as much screen time as he appears to be to portray the visual effects of guilt, including the lips that he used to kiss Jesus becoming more and more cracked and blistered as time goes on.
Oh, that's why it looks out he's making out with the wall. That is what it looks like!
Anyway, and Satan is present at his suicide to emphasize that she's the villain, and to contrast how Jesus is always trying to save people from their sins, whereas she is using their sin to guilt them into death.
Speaking of which, the demon children. Yes, we can't have our actor's performance portray Judas's guilt eating at him and ultimately killing himself. We have to have him heckled to death by demon children. Well, Mr. Gibson isn't the most subtle director, is he?
Next up is Mary Magdalene. She's good, but it's another case where you don't really know it's her for like an hour into the movie. She hangs out with Mother Mary, but there's nothing really explicit said about her character or who she is until the flashback to the Pericope Adulterae.
Which is even funnier when you consider that wasn't even Mary Magdalene at all, but that's another discussion for another time. Also, you notice there isn't really any dialogue in this flashback either. We don't actually see the Pharisees accusing her of adultery, or we don't even get Jesus to take a crack at, "Let he who has no sin cast the first stone." So, once again, you kind of need to already know the story.
I mean, you can infer some, but it's not nearly as much as the movie wants you to be able to. So, next.
Well, that'd be Mary, mother of Jesus. Now, Mr. Gibson's inner Catholic background really comes through here, as Protestants, as a general rule, tend to be a little allergic to Mary outside of Christmas.
I agree, actually. She carries herself with so much grace, and her relationship with her son is emphasized really well. There are multiple moments where they make eye contact through the crowd, and she gives her an approving nod to him, even though she knows that there's nothing she could do about it anyway.
Plus, she acts like a mother. You can see her thinking back to the good times they had, you know, the good old days, and you can tell that she wants to go out there and help him. It's her child, and she loves him, and she just wants to ease his pain and help him somehow, but there is nothing that she can do, and she's helpless. And it is this helplessness that enables us to identify with her almost as much as we do with Jesus.
And her final scene is a haunting rendition of the Pieta.
You know, I remember reading that the near fourth wall break was supposed to convey to the audience, what part did you play in this? What sin of yours did he die for? Was it really worth it? It is an interesting take on the Pieta, to be sure.
I like it personally, even if it's a little odd to make as much eye contact with her as we do as a viewer.
I think the only thing I might have added, honestly, would have been maybe another flashback. When Jesus is taken to the temple as a baby, and he's greeted by the old man Simeon. After seeing Jesus, he turns to Mary and he says, "And the sword will pierce your heart. Hail Mary, full of grace indeed."
Up next is the high priest Caiaphas. He's portrayed as somewhat of a corrupt official, including briefly emphasizing how Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin doesn't actually abide by the law. But the big question is, why does he want Jesus executed so badly? There's a moment where he asks Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus responds with, "I am." In the captions, that's all caps, which has to be a reference to Exodus, where God gives his name as "I am that I am" to Moses.
So he's executing Jesus for claiming to be God.
Well, that appears to be Gibson's intent, but in Mark and Matthew's Gospel, this moment plays as Caiaphas is putting Jesus on trial for threatening to destroy the temple, and he's just sending him up the river on whatever charge they can make stick. But we'll come back to that later.
Caiaphas' motivations tend to range from misinterpreting Jesus' threat to destroy the temple, fear that the Romans won't take too kindly to having a new king in town, frustration that he's always making them look really bad in public, and just cutting in on their profits. Somehow this movie manages to not really give him any.
Up next is our most reluctant member of the cast, Pontius Pilate. Now, he's written and acted pretty well. He's played as a standard military procurator, and his wife acts as the external voice of his conscience, whom he ultimately ignores.
He refers directly to a reprimand by Caesar that he's being too violent, which is why he tries to get Jesus off the hook, and why he ultimately caves when it looks like a riot is about to break out. Now, technically, this reprimand is historically based, though any connection between it and his interaction with Jesus really is up for speculation, especially since the exact year of Jesus' death is uncertain.
Well, now that said, it does its job bridging the Pilate outside the Gospels as a vindictive, bloodthirsty authority, with the Pilate in the Gospels who tries to save Jesus from the mob calling for his death. Up next is, ooh, this should be interesting, the devil herself.
Okay, seriously, enough of the frickin' devil! Seriously, Satan's job in this movie seems to be to stand around and watch all these horrible things happening to Jesus. And, to be fair, the idea of the devil appearing in the garden to tempt Jesus to not go through with all these horrible things that are going to happen to him is interesting, and is something that has been done before in other depictions of Christ, such as the Miracle Maker and Godspell and that Jesus TV movie from the 90s. But the only problem is, it's done so much that it gets really old really, really fast. For example, the Demon Mother and Baby. Apparently this is supposed to be a perverted take on the beloved Our Lady of the Streets painting, because a mother and child is the most beautiful sight in the world and the devil makes everything ugly and blah blah blah. But what does that have to do with Jesus getting flogged to death? It is not deep. It is annoying. Stop it!
Next?
Yes, next. Okay, we're at the main attraction, Yeshua himself.
She means Jesus.
I'm just doing what the movie does. Anyway, Jim Caviezel is doing a good job. He really is acting his heart out here.
Oh, not like that, Willem Dafoe. Put that back. Bad. Anyway, I think this is an instance of a great actor working with something that the script doesn't give him, because on paper, this Jesus is as dull as the one from The Greatest Story Ever Told. A big way that the script deflates the character is by not showing the temple incident, because, as we previously mentioned, that may indeed be the reason Jesus comes under fire in the first place.
By not actually showing the temple incident or having Jesus or one of the disciples relay their account, you really only have Caiaphas' word to go on that this even happened in the first place. And you can't really do that and expect to continue to promote your protagonist as suffering unjustly. Jesus supposedly threatened to destroy a national landmark in the center of religious activity, which really would be kind of like doing a movie about Jim Jones or something and expect to try to say that he was pressed. People would cry foul. Jesus' role in the story appears to be that he's being punished by God in place of all humanity. Which, I guess, would explain why it's so famously violent.
Well, now wait a minute, we're both coming at this from a Protestant background.
So?
Mel Gibson isn't. He's Roman Catholic.
Right.
Penal substitution is a Protestant theory of atonement, whereas Catholics are more interested in the satisfaction view.
Remind me which one that is again?
Okay, God created mankind to obey him, but Adam and Eve disobeyed, thus putting all of humanity in debt, more obedience than they can possibly offer. This put the universe out of whack. So Jesus, who owes God nothing, goes and pays him a great obedience, even to the point of death on a cross. And then anyone identified under Jesus' banner has that obedience applied to them, and thus order is restored. That's why Jesus quotes Revelation of all things at one point by saying, "I make all things new," which Mel says on the audio commentary is the crux of the film.
Oh, so when Jesus is getting pummeled, the point is that he can back out of this at any time. This is why Satan tries to tempt him in the garden, and why he says that no one takes my life from me, I lay it down of my own accord, and why he stands up defiantly during the scourging scene.
Well, now, hypothetically, you're right, but if that was the point, then several of these scenes would have been edited differently. After all, you could have ended the scourging scene after either Jesus stands up defiantly and then they keep whipping him, or after his mother says, "My son, when, where, how will you choose to be delivered of this?" Either would get the point across effectively, but we just keep going, seeing all of it in literally grotesque detail. I don't think Gibson understands that there's such a thing as implied violence. If you cut from him being whipped to him having new wounds, people would understand the point.
I dreaded watching this movie because of its violence. I avoided it like the plague. But upon finally seeing it, I've come to the conclusion that I'm not really sure that the violence is this movie's problem. And honestly, I'm not even sure if the "it's too violent" argument holds up anymore. But that might be just because I've been watching too much Game of Thrones.
Well, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, between all the violence filmed so beautifully and often in slow-mo, if this had come out a decade later, people would confuse it with a Zack Snyder movie.
I mean, it does get a little excessive at times, but for different reasons. For example, it was a common practice for you to be flogged before crucifixion, so you would be weaker, so you would die sooner. And afterwards, your back and legs would be that torn up. But they flip him over, so they flog his front, so literally every single inch of him is covered in blood, which in and of itself should have killed him.
Well, besides, we've only been talking about one scene in this entire movie. He gets beat up a lot.
That's true. The guards start beating him up almost immediately after arresting him. And, you know, they're dragging him off. There's that part where they just throw him over the wall and dangle him there by his chains for no particular reason other than, ha-ha.
All right, where is he?
We're sorry, sir. He's dead already.
What? How?
Well, we were just having a little bit of fun, you know, kicking him around a little bit, and an eye patch here thought it would be funny to throw him off the wall outside and dangle him there, and, well, he was all wrapped up in chains, and there was a rope around his neck, and it turns out you can hang a man that way. Or bad.
All right, I suppose this meeting is cancelled. We can all go home.
And then you have the soldiers who are always yelling at him at the Via Dolorosa, "Come on, hurry up, we haven't got all day!" Even though they're the ones that are constantly knocking him over instead of just letting him fall on his own like the 3 falls in the Station of the Cross. And then there's, flipping the cross over to hammer the nails in the other way, and then there's dislocating his shoulder when you're driving the nail in, and, yeah, we're gonna have a bird come down and just peck out one of the thief's eyes, because, sure, why not?
It would be one thing to have Jesus dying nobly for his ideals, but we see maybe a minute and a half of his preaching total in flashbacks, and there's not enough narrative tissue to connect that to his execution, and you need more to make that work.
The amount of pain and suffering in this movie actually does make it kind of depressing to sit through. In fact, test audiences actually did complain that the Passion was too dark. Imagine that. Anyway, Gibson's answer to this was to insert a more humorous scene with the relationship between Jesus and his mother, the good times, which in this case takes the form of Jesus making a modern-day dining table for a rich customer. And then we get the "it'll never catch on" joke.
Here's how this scene could have worked better. There are already funny moments in the Gospels, and it's not like Jesus movies are unaware of this. Godspell is almost entirely predicated on it. I mean, they go so far as to take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck of sawdust out of your brother's into a vaudeville-style routine between Jesus and Judas. Even the relatively dry Jesus film knew that a camel going through an eye of a needle was a funny enough mental image to get a laugh out of. Or, since you're already doing most of Jesus' dialogue in Aramaic, you have an unprecedented opportunity to actually capitalize on a funny moment that is often overlooked, and further the plot at the same time. When Jesus is railing against the Pharisees and lawyers in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, "You would strain at a gnat to swallow a camel." But in Aramaic, that sounds like you would strain at a gamla to swallow a galma. But all of these opportunities were wasted in favor of an "it'll never catch on" joke. Smooth.
Speaking of missed opportunities, I was honestly really surprised that the Centurion didn't get a crack at the line that John Wayne famously flubbed. I mean, all throughout the movie we see him grow more and more sympathetic towards Jesus and his plight. You might as well give the Centurion an arc.
Well, not every opportunity was missed, though. This film is gorgeously shot.
True. That raindrop transition into the storm was beautiful. That opening in the garden, absolutely beautiful.
And I really respect this movie for the way it handles crowd scenes. For instance, in the Garden of Gethsemane, everybody's busy fighting, so they don't notice Jesus healing Malchus's ear. Or Veronica is able to get through on the Via Dolorosa to Jesus with her veil, because everyone, again, is fighting. And then Peter is always just one face in a throng, and it doesn't feel like he's being singled out. And then his dramatic look between him and Jesus is done in slow-mo, as Jesus' face just happens to get knocked in that direction.
Now, Mr. Gibson, you might want to tone down on the lens flares, sun flares. He's doing the Sermon on the Mount. This is a good scene, and Caviezel's doing a good job. I think. And not every scene transitions into the next one quite as well as you'd think it should. And speaking of correct transitions, we haven't even touched on the Anti-Semitism issue yet. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, I can certainly see where it's coming from. After all, Judas sells out a godly man for money, and Caiaphas runs a kangaroo court to condemn an innocent man to death, and neither is presented with any real sympathetic reason to do so.
We are forgetting one thing, though. Everybody in this movie acts like that. Seriously, the only people that are depicted as the good guys in this movie are the ones who already support Jesus. So, you could make the argument that this movie isn't so much anti-Semitic as it is anti-everybody who's not already a Christian.
Well, that part would therefore be right out of the Gospels. But you know what isn't?
What?
It's the methods of crucifixion. The filmmakers and fans like to defend the movie by saying its violence is justified because it just accurately reflects Roman executions. And that would be all well and good, except for the fact that the thieves are crucified entirely differently. Jesus is scourged and then crucified on a Latin cross that has to be hoisted up into a hole in the ground. Meanwhile, the thieves are not scourged and are nailed to crossbeams that are put up onto an already standing post, forming a tau cross.
I remember reading that this was intentional on the filmmakers' part because they realized that Jesus carrying the full Latin cross just happens to be the image that people are most familiar with.
Which is fine. This movie doesn't owe anybody historical accuracy. But it's the inconsistency that bothers me. By treating Jesus worse and treating the thieves better, it makes it seem like the Romans went out of their way to punish Jesus more, even though they have no reason to do so.
So in conclusion, I am glad that I saw this movie. It is genuinely moving at times, but there's just one problem. I'm already the target audience. I already know the story. I know basically all of it. And I already believe it, which means that I'm going to be able to look past its flaws better than a non-Christian viewer can. I remember reading a review once that lamented that this movie depicts Christ's suffering, but it doesn't really convey what it was all for. And that is this movie's biggest fault.
The script expects its audience too much to understand what's going on already, and it expects you to know the story that you're currently being told.
It mentions sin, and it shows the devil a lot, but not really in a way that's going to make sense to a non-Christian audience. And because of that, only the already religious will truly be moved by this movie. So, in terms of a rating, I would give it a worth renting on Good Friday, which would make it a...
It's an A for effort.
Okay.
And that goes for the recut as well.
I still can't believe there is a recut.
It's pretty much the same movie. Don't waste your time.
Okay. Thank you for joining us on Faith on Film. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Nathan. And you can tell that I'm confusing my line with your line now.
That's
Islam.
okay.
He's portrayed as somewhat of a corrupt... not like that. Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe. Can't say Willem Dafoe for some reason.
It happens.